And we begin the afternoon newscast with all the latest coming in on Wion's continuous coverage of the Sri Lanka elections. Polling is currently underway in the island nation with 15.9 million registered voters. This is being touted as a watershed moment in the history of one of Asia's oldest democracies. And this is an election like never seen before. Both leading contenders, Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Sajith Premadasa, have arrived at their respective polling stations to cast their vote. Now, Rajapaksa appeared extremely confident as he arrived at the polling booth, saying the people of Sri Lanka could get a better future under him.
Sir, do you feel confident, sir?
Yes. Very confident, very confident.
Sir, how confident are you, sir?
Very confident.
Sorry?
Very confident.
And sir, what do you want to bring to the people of Sri Lanka, sir? Sir, if elected,
People of Sri Lanka will get a better future under me, under my presidency.
His main rival, Sajith Premadasa, took to Twitter urging people to go out early and cast their votes to elect the country's next leader. Sri Lanka's election authority has also revealed instances of efforts to influence voters in many polling booths. In the southeastern district of Monaragala, local leaders were seen attempting to influence voters in favour of Rajapaksa's SLPP party. Meanwhile, a convoy of Muslim voters were ambushed in northwestern Sri Lanka merely hours before polling opened in the country. Now, police said that the gunman burnt tyres of major roads to set up roadblocks, after which a convoy of 100 buses were ambushed. Police say that there have been no reports of casualties so far and that 2 buses were shot in during this attack. Let's quickly go across to Sri Lanka as I'm joined in by Rashika Jayakode, a youth leader in Premadasa's camp. Let's get in some perspective from Rashika. Rashika, welcome to Wion. How would you react to today's reports of an ambush and instances of efforts to influence the voter, as has been revealed by the election authority while Sri Lankans are casting their vote?
I think especially the SLPP, Mr. Rajapaksa's camp was particularly concerned about the lack of support from the minority communities, especially the Tamils and the Muslims. As a result, we've seen various attempts since yesterday to discourage these minority communities from voting. Even last night, there were multiple false reports saying that there was excessive military presence in the north, so that the Tamils will not go out to vote in favor of Mr. Premadasa. So I think this is this incident, this shooting incident, is the latest in a series of events, incidents aimed at disenfranchising minorities, especially which have pledged to come out in large numbers to support Mr. Premadasa. So we condemn this attack, and we also believe that the culprits should be brought to justice as soon as possible.
Rashika, we've just heard what Gotabaya had to say. It's a very confident-looking Rajapaksa camp coming across to the media. How is the mood with Premadasa's camp at the moment?
He is extremely confident because Mr. Premadasa is a leader who emerged from the grassroots level. He has been working in the Hambantota district, which is the southern tip of Sri Lanka, one of an area which doesn't enjoy the benefits of development. He has been working in that electorate for the past 25 years. He has a very strong grassroots level appeal. He is somewhat similar to Mr. Narendra Modi in India, who enjoys a large support base from the grassroots level communities. At the same time, Mr. Premadasa is appealing to the ethnic and religious minorities, especially in the north and east provinces, and they have pledged to support him. So with all these elements coming together, I think Mr. Premadasa is well positioned to become the 7th executive president of Sri Lanka. Mr. Premadasa enjoys a large support base from the south because of his grassroots background, and his father has been his father is considered a hero in terms of poverty alleviation in Sri Lanka. So the Premadasa legacy is also another factor that will work in favor of Mr. Premadasa. So I believe it's Mr. Premadasa who's the front runner, and he's well positioned to win the election. But having said that, I agree that the presidential election will be a hotly contested one. It's going to be a keen, very close fight. But I firmly believe that Mr. Premadasa will become the winner when the final results are released tomorrow.
It is indeed a neck-to-neck fight, and it's interesting that you compared Mr. Premadasa to Narendra Modi. Now, you know, Mr. Premadasa is someone who's maintained a low-key, even projected a soft image. What's Premadasa's strength compared to strongman Gotabaya Rajapaksa?
Mr. Premadasa has been in politics for 25 years, which is a fairly long time by Sri Lankan standards. But he hasn't faced any corruption allegation. He hasn't faced any criminal allegation throughout his career as a politician. It has been an unblemished track record. It has been an extremely clean track record. He doesn't face a single court case over corruption or any other criminal activity. Whereas Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa faces multiple allegations, multiple investigations, and multiple cases over corruption and abuse of power. I think this is the factor that differentiates Mr. Premadasa from his rival, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa. At the same time, Mr. Premadasa is largely perceived as a leader who's open to media scrutiny, who's open to engage with the media, who's ready to address, who's ready to answer to the media queries, whereas Mr. Rajapaksa has always been shying away from public dialogues and other debates where he has to outline his policies. So I think these two factors will be critical when deciding the final outcome of the election. Especially the public believes Mr. Premadasa as a relatively young leader who can usher in development and prosperity to Sri Lanka. And he also championed the housing cause that he embarked upon 4 years ago. He has already built 2,500 model villages in Sri Lanka, giving shelter to over 60,000 families, which is a significant project. So all these elements all these factors will come into play at the presidential election.
It's interesting, Rashika, that you've mentioned about Premadasa's clean past. Do you think Sri Lanka is willing to start from scratch and it's looking to make a fresh start when it comes to forming their government? Because let's not forget that none of the ruling government members are contesting this year's election.
Of course, I mean, any kind of presidential election is a new opening. For instance, Mr. Premadasa's manifesto covers comprehensively, I mean, almost every aspect of governance. And Mr. Premadasa is perceived within our camp as a progressive leader who is determined to serve the oppressed communities in the country, the oppressed segments in our society. So he's very strong on the social welfare front. So he's not a person who's hell-bent on adopting neoliberal policies. So he's a people-centric leader. So I think under his presidency, Sri Lanka will strongly move towards people-centric policies and people-centric, especially economic policies, where the poorest of the poor will be benefited and the less privileged segments of our society will be benefited. I think Mr. Premadasa is the champion of that cause.
All right, Rashika, let's not negate the fact that it is a make or break election for Sri Lanka. What are the issues at stake, considering the polls are happening after last year's constitutional crisis and this year's Easter bombings?
Of course, the national security remains high on both camps. I mean, where as far as our agendas are concerned, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa has promised, a very strong defence establishment under his presidency. At the same time, Mr. Premadasa has also suggested similar or even better reforms, such as a legalized National Security Council, the creation of a new post, National Security Advisor, and a couple of new acts to strengthen financial intelligence and the military intelligence. So Mr. Premadasa always advocates institutional reforms to strengthen national security without relying on individual performance. Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa is riding his legacy as the war-winning Defence Ministry Secretary, whereas Mr. Premadasa is more focused on institutional reforms that will strengthen the defence establishment. So that's the fundamental difference between the two camps. Right. Having said that, Mr. Premadasa has also promised to appoint former Army Commander Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca, the war-winning military commander in Sri Lanka, as the highest person in his defence establishment. So we can assume that Mr. Fonseca will get the post of the defence minister under the Premadasa presidency. So national security is number one, and then economic prosperity, that is also a very high priority on our agenda. And as I explained to you earlier, Mr. Premadasa is geared to adopt people-centric economic policies that will benefit the poor.
So two very key issues being addressed by the UNP. Now, let's also come to the minority factor. In 2010 and 2015, we are aware that an en bloc was there that cast its vote in favor of Mahinda Rajapaksa's principal rivals. How crucial is this minority factor for the UNP and for Premadasa?
It's very crucial because minorities believe Mr. Premadasa is the only leader, whereas as far as the main contenders are concerned, Mr. Premadasa is the only leader whom they can have faith in, because Mr. Premadasa is open to discuss their issues. He's open to give them solutions. The northern province alone has about 850,000 voters, which is very critical to the final result of the election. The largest Tamil party in the north, the Tamil National Alliance, North and East, Tamil National Alliance, have pledged support to the UNP. The northern politics is basically dominated by the TNA. So TNA is on our side. At the same time, Mr. Premadasa said he would not betray the unitary status of the country. He will not compromise on the unitary status of the country. He will not divide the country under any circumstances, but he is willing to negotiate the maximum devolution of power within a unitary Sri Lanka. That has been our policy on the national issue, and Mr. Premadasa is ready to deliver on that.
Before I let you go, at a time when the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka is on the rise, what do ties with India mean for the United National Party and Sajith Premadasa?
The UNP's foreign policy in Mr. Premadasa's manifesto is crystal clear. He says Sri Lanka first foreign policy, in which Sri Lanka's interests will come to the fore. We will not align ourselves with any particular power bloc in the world. We will not align ourselves with any particular superpower in the world, but we will work with every country, big or small, aiming to benefit the people of Sri Lanka. At the same time, we believe we consider India as a critical factor concerning our foreign policy, because India is our closest neighbor and we have shared a long-standing relationship with India on many fronts. At the same time, China has invested heavily in Sri Lanka. So we will work with every country without any particular or special affiliation with anyone. We'll always put Sri Lanka's interests first and see what Sri Lanka can gain through our foreign policy endeavors. That is Mr. Premadasa's foreign policy.
All right, that's a fair way to put it across. Thank you so much, Rashaka Jayakode, for joining us here on this live broadcast. We wish the UNP the very best. Let the best man win. That is the note on which I would like to end this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us here on Wion.